Great. Thanks everyone for joining us. Good evening and welcome to the Village of Cumberland's Tree Protection Bylaw online event. I will leave it to Karen Albert from the village to start us off here.
Yeah, good evening. I'm Karen Albert, Senior Planner with the Village of Cumberland, and I just want to acknowledge that I'm participating from the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation, and we're really happy to be able to have this presentation from Camille today. This is a project that the village has been working towards for a long time. The council adopted a urban forest management plan in 2020. And one of the recommendations in that plan was to review the possibilities of a tree protection bylaw. And that's really what the meeting today is about. And Camille will introduce that a bit more just to, share what some of the options are for tree protection bylaw and then get everyone's input who's here today. So yeah, thank you very much. And I'll be here for the whole presentation, also for questions at the end. I'll hand over to Camille.
Great. Thanks, Karen. And yeah, hi, everyone. Thanks again for joining us this evening. We really appreciate you spending time with us, especially on such a beautiful evening. As was mentioned, my name is Camille Lefrançois. I'm the Environmental Planning Manager with Diamond Head Consulting. We are based out of Vancouver, British Columbia, and we really specialize in working with communities to manage their natural and environmental assets in and around places where people live. Also joining me this evening is my colleague and principal, Emilia Niduba, who is overseeing our team and a lot of the work that we do on urban forestry across the province and currently with the district or the village of Cumberland. So yeah, we're really excited to be here with you this evening. As I had mentioned, we are starting with a presentation, which I'm hoping will last about 30 minutes. The presentation is focused on a few things. So we want to give you a bit of background on why this project came to be and what our scope of work is. And then we'll give you a brief overview of some of options that are out there for municipalities in British Columbia to regulate trees and the key elements that we find in tree protection bylaws. And then once we get to the end of the presentation, we'll be happy to take your questions, and we'll also have a couple for you to hear from you on what you think would be important for the village to do. And then we'll wrap up at the very end with some project next steps. So why this project? Our team started working with the village on this scope of work because there was an interest in looking at options to regulate trees in the village. Of course, this comes out of a few items. The official community plan has a number of objectives that are really relevant when we think about why the village might want to regulate trees and how it might want to go about regulating trees, including some objectives about environmental preservation for the protection and enhancement of your natural environment, and even some of your economic development. Of course, there's a lot of importance attached to nature and trees and ecosystems in and around the village. So looking at things like expanding, promoting, and preserving the village working forests, environmentally sensitive and natural areas. So when the village is thinking about where we might go for tree protection and our team beginning our work, that's some of the places that we look to get some guidance on what might be most relevant to your local context. As Karen was mentioning as well, of course, the village developed an urban forest management plan in recent years, which identified among some things a decline in canopy cover, a fairly significant decline in canopy cover over recent decades, which was in part related to impacts due to development. During that work, there was also it was also identified that there was a fairly large support from the community or interest in more private tree protection to try and make sure more trees are saved around the village. And the plan also does set out a canopy cover target, both village-wide and for the urban areas. So the plan is seeking to maintain canopy cover stable within the village as a whole, but to increase it by 10% in urban areas. So a fairly ambitious target there, and certainly one that would be related to how the district approach or the village approaches and the way it manages its trees. In more specifically, the urban forest management plan recommended that a tree protection bylaw be developed for the village that is inclusive of a number of things, including things like ensuring there are a replacement tree requirement for when trees need to be removed for new construction, and that trees are better protected around construction sites. So for our team coming into our work, it's really a great resource for us to build from. There was a lot of community engagement done on this project as well. We're doing a little bit more now to hear more from you about some details for what you want. And that'll be very important in directing our work moving forward. So in terms of the scope of our team at this time, we are working to make some recommendations to council on the development of a tree bylaw based on a few items. So our team is doing some background research. There are some good documentation out there in terms of some best practices and standard ways municipalities deal with their tree protection bylaws that our team is reviewing in relationship to your local context to make sure that we can look at good options that are existing and possible, which might be desirable for the village to consider. And then public input is another important part of that. In order for us to develop our recommendations, we want to hear more from the community about what you think is important for the village to achieve if it is to develop a tree protection bylaw. And so we'll be taking the findings from our research as well as the community engagement to develop a draft or a background report, if you will, with some recommendations that we will be asking your council for guidance on before we start drafting a bylaw in the coming months. And then alongside with the draft tree protection bylaw, our team may also recommend some other bylaw updates that could be relevant for the village to consider in terms of making sure that the tree regulations are really good from all angles in the village. And just briefly, in terms of our project timeline, our work started in January of this year. We're now in May, and we've been busy doing some of that background research I was just talking about. We now have a survey that's open. If you haven't filled it out yet, I would certainly strongly encourage you to do so. It'll be open until early June. And once we receive the results from our engagements, we'll be writing that background report and recommendations to go to your council, most likely in June or July. And then with your council's directions, we'll move to drafting the bylaw and then eventually into adoption in the months to come. So with this project overview, I wanted to start us off just before we get into some of the details of what tree protection bylaws can do for the village or in general for a community. We do like to take a moment to recognize that tree regulations are a lot broader really than just tree protection bylaws. There are a lot of different policy and regulatory tools that communities can use to help improve the outcome for their trees in their communities. So when our team looks at tree protection in any given community, there are 3 levels of regulations that we tend to look at, if you will. The first one is for that higher level vision and guidance. And this is looking at items such as your official community plan that I was mentioning earlier, which really sets some important policies to guide the village's intention for how it wants to manage its environment and its trees. And this is a really important piece of that puzzle. Your official community plan also already has some really supportive language in terms of how it wants to approach preserving and protecting its natural areas. And that is always an important part of understanding how tree regulations will work in any given place. But the other piece that I wanted to highlight before we get into the details of tree bylaws is really those tools, those regulatory tools that focus on creating the space for trees to grow. And those are what we call land use bylaws. They're mostly focused on regulating how we use land. And as a result, because they dictate things like how large buildings are, where they should be sited on a property, how large the property should be, because they have such a directive approach to regulating how we develop land, they can really have really important impacts on where we have space left to either protect or plant new trees. And so your zoning and subdivision bylaw play certainly an important role in making sure that we keep some space for trees to grow. And it is something that we have in mind when we think about regulations. For example, your zoning bylaw right now has landscaping requirements when a new laneway home or a new laneway home goes in to plant a new tree. That's one interesting way a zoning bylaw can help support tree planting. So we won't go into too many details on that today. It is a little bit outside of the scope of what we do, but I did want to put that out there just to help everyone understand that beyond the tree bylaw itself, there are a lot of other pieces that control the outcomes for trees. And then the last type of regulations are those that are primarily focused on trees. So this would include your development permit areas that are associated with your official community plan. You already have some that focus on environmental protection. And then the tree bylaw could add a layer there to add further protections to trees and regulations around how they're protected and replaced over time. So with that said, I wanted to spend the remainder of my presentation giving you an overview of some of the important items that we look at when we are developing or updating a tree protection bylaw. Of course, like any bylaws that a municipality can put out, the province of British Columbia is actually the one who decides what powers municipalities have and to what extent they can regulate land. And so that's no different for tree bylaws. There are certain bounds that municipalities have to work within. And then there's also common or more or less common ways that municipalities go about using their ability to regulate trees. So I'll give you an overview of a few different types of elements that we like to call value informed. Of course, tree bylaws have some items that are more administrative and best management practice in nature, but they also have a lot of components that need to be anchored on what a community wants to achieve with that regulation and just really what's important for a community to achieve in terms of tree protection. So there's three main classes, if you will, that I like to think about for where those elements are, and I'll give you an overview of what's included for what could be included for each of those categories for the Village of Cumberland, so that you get a sense of the breadth of things that we'll be considering when we come up with some recommendations later on. So the first one of those is defining what is regulated. So that typically would be the type of land and the types of trees that your bylaw would apply to. And then how it is regulated. So looking at what type of regulations apply to the land and the trees that fall within your bylaw. And then how it is implemented, some of the details related to the way in which we implement those regulations. So I'll take you through each of those three, give you a sense of options that are out there that we will be considering for the Village of Cumberland. As I mentioned earlier, we haven't defined any recommendations at this time. We are waiting to hear back from the community before we get to that stage. So what I'm presenting to you right now really is more of a menu of options of some of the typical things that communities do regulate. And in order to do that, I've got an image here of a fictional community just to kind of illustrate what I mean as I'm talking. So you can get a better visual for it. As I mentioned, the first thing that I wanted to cover with you is defining what is regulated in a bylaw. So the first thing that a bylaw needs to do is to define where it applies. And that might be based on different types of properties or different types of applications coming into the municipality. As I mentioned as well, though, we also have some bounds that are set by the province for what tree bylaws can do at the municipal level. And one of the ones that is most relevant for your community is the fact that a tree protection bylaw cannot apply to things like working forest. Those are regulated under a different regime through the province. So that would be first one piece that we might be looking at, not including in this tree protection bylaw, simply because that's something that the village doesn't have the ability to do. But beyond those working forests, the village could decide where it wants to apply its bylaw. Some example of what some communities are doing in some areas, communities decide they really want to regulate trees on developing properties, and that is the sole focus of their bylaw. Would be any property that comes with an application related to development to the community, then would also have to respond to regulations related to the tree protection bylaw. In other communities, they decide that larger properties, or perhaps undeveloped, what is often called greenfield properties that are primarily forested, would be the only properties where the tree bylaw applies. And that would be the case in communities where the focus is really on those areas that might be developing in the future and making sure that we have some protection measures in place. And then again, in other communities, they would rather apply the tree bylaw across every property and make sure that they're applying the regulations to all sorts of contexts. So again, those are all options that we will be looking at, and that could be possible for the village to consider for its regulation. Now, the other piece to the what is regulated is really the types of trees that we are seeking to regulate through this bylaw. So again, a bylaw would simply define how it applies, and usually that would include specifying what they consider to be protected trees under the bylaw. There are really kind of three big categories in terms of how municipalities most commonly do this. So in some communities, they might decide that their focus is really trying to protect those larger diameter trees that you see in purple here. So a community might decide they only want to focus on those trees, and that's the one that are really important for the regulation to apply to. In other communities, they'd rather protect a larger proportion of their urban forest, and they might go about protecting anything that is a medium or large diameter, so including both the blue and the purple trees that you see on here. And in other communities, they might go even smaller and go all the way down to much smaller trees and protect most of the trees in the community and apply some regulations to them. When you take that in combination with the types of properties or applications that you're looking at, then you really get a sense of how much of your urban forest you're seeking to regulate. And again, that's really dependent on what the community values and where the community wants to see some of those regulations be applied based on the priorities. The other item that's important in that conversation is, for a lot of communities, tree bylaws are also an opportunity to add further protection for trees of really high significance. Those could be many things, but the most common types of high significance tree that we see in tree protection bylaw could be things like trees that grow in sensitive ecosystems, like a riparian area. It could also be, again, those very large diameter tree. We might want to protect more of our urban forests overall in the bylaw, but apply some really specific regulation on those really large mature trees because they're particularly important to a community. And then similarly, other communities also like to nominate specific trees because of their importance for heritage, or because perhaps they're important species that they want to protect at a smaller size because they provide such important services to their ecosystems. So again, when we group all of those options together, we can land on a bit of a menu where we can pick from based on what a community is most interested in achieving with its regulations. As I mentioned, once we define what is regulated, we also really like to take a look at how a community can regulate whatever it is that we decide is most important to be regulated in your tree bylaw. There's really two things that we will try and weigh when we're looking at a tree protection bylaw. Some bylaws are really focused on trying to achieve the maximum amount of retention, so keeping existing trees in the ground where they are. And those would be fairly restrictive bylaws in terms of requiring people to meet really specific conditions to be allowed to get a tree removal permit. So that is one approach that communities can take, again, depending on what their values and priorities are for how they regulate trees. And then on the other side of the spectrum, other communities decide that rather than really focusing on retaining existing trees, their bylaws might be most importantly focused on ensuring that when those trees that are regulated under the bylaw are removed, we're planting some replacement trees so that the canopy cover can be sustained over time. In reality, most bylaws will land somewhere in the middle. It's rare that we have any bylaw going any one end of the spectrum or the other. So often it will be a combination of both. And again, where we land in terms of balancing the protection of existing trees with the replacement is really up to what's the priority in any given community and what we are trying to achieve with the tree protection bylaw. And then the last thing I'll mention here is really focused on how we implement the bylaw itself. There's a number of things that can be done to balance a little bit of that carrot or stick approach, if you will, for tree protection bylaws. Of course, bylaws are primarily a restriction tool, but they can also offer some incentives. There's ways to build mechanisms in to encourage, for example, a property that is developing to retain the most important trees that we've defined in this bylaw that can be built in if that is something that we are trying to achieve with this bylaw. Another item there is also permit fees. Of course, there are usually fees associated with seeking a tree removal permit. They can vary in the extent that they reach. Of course, tree bylaws, because they require applications to be submitted and reviewed, do require some staff resources. So usually there's some portion of the permit fees that would help fund some of the staffing needs for implementing a bylaw. But again, some communities prefer to keep those fees low and primarily fund the bylaw implementation to general taxation. So again, there's a bit of a value decision there. And there's a number of enforcement tools that can be used to make sure that the municipality has the ability to make sure that those regulations are not only on paper, but also can be enforced if and when someone goes against the regulations that are in place. So those three items, I'm hoping that will give you a good overview. I know bylaws can be a bit technical, so hopefully that gives you a good sense of some of the components that we're looking at in our menu of options at this time. And we'll be curious to hear your thoughts on it at the end. When we think about those, all of those options that I just mentioned for how the community could go about regulating its trees, there's really three big objectives that we'd like to keep in mind for how we might land on the best regulation for your local context. The first one is focused on urban forest protection. So, of course, tree protection bylaws are usually brought in because the community is trying to improve protection of its urban forest, and that certainly is an important consideration for us. Better understanding exactly what it is that we are trying to protect is really helpful. And you can decide then based on that what level of regulation is most helpful to achieve that objective. But as I mentioned, there is also a cost associated with regulation. Having a tree bylaw in place will require people in the community to submit a permit application, depending on how much of the community this bylaw applies to, of course. And it will require some staff time to review those applications and issue the permits and so forth. So when we're thinking about the best possible outcome, in addition to thinking about how much urban forest protection we're trying to reach, we should also consider realistically how much we're willing to spend on some regulatory mechanisms like a tree bylaw, so that we can decide something that is both desirable and achievable for the community. And then the final objective that I'll mention there, which I'm sure is likely on your mind, is of course private property regulations. When we think about protecting trees, there are very many reasons why that might be a good and important thing for a community to do, particularly in a context where you see a lot of trees being lost, and you want to maintain them because of their importance for your community's character. With that said, of course, tree bylaws do place restrictions on what people are able to do with trees on their property, of various levels of restrictions, I should say, because of course there's quite a wide spectrum of options, as I've just presented to you, that we could go with for any given tree protection bylaw. Finding out how much is reasonable to place in terms of restrictions on private property is another important part of that puzzle for us. So again, we might want to achieve the best possible urban forest protection ever, but we might not be willing to do that to the extent of requiring everyone to get a permit to remove any tree they have on their property. So we're trying to, consider all of those objectives and find a balanced and right approach for prioritizing what's important to the community and implementing a bylaw that will work for your local context. And then finally, I will just mention so that you are aware, aside from all of those value-driven components that I've just outlined, there are also some more best practice or administrative bylaw components that we are looking at. Those are not so much a focus of our conversation simply because they are typically not so anchored on community values, but just in making sure that the bylaw is functional and works well once it's put into place. And so those will be included in the recommendations we bring to your council, and they will include recommendations related to application and permit requirements to allow staff to review adequately the types of exemptions that may need to be included for things to do with, for example, those working forests that the village is not allowed to regulate, or also other types of components like ensuring people can continue to remove hazardous trees and all of that. We also would look at including technical standards to make sure that trees are adequately protected on construction sites, so that when we're retaining trees, we're not damaging them through construction, and that we're making sure that the replacement trees that are going in, if those requirements are a part of the bylaw, also give the trees a good chance to thrive and grow in the future. And similarly, looking at some of the enforcement mechanisms that are really important for a bylaw to be well and functioning. So that is all I wanted to cover today for the presentation. I think I've been talking for long enough. At this point, we will be getting ready to turn it over first for questions from you, if you have any clarifying questions that you'd like to bring up, and then we'll be happy to have a discussion afterwards. We do have a couple of questions for you as well. So with that, I will stop the recording and then stop sharing my screen so that we can come back to our room.